Ever since time began, man has been fascinated by the mystery of the moon. But over 60 years ago, writer H.G. Wells anticipated the shape of things to come with his fascinating adventure, First Men in the Moon. The story of the first men to bridge the 250,000 miles between heaven and earth. This is how it began.
This is a solemn moment in the history of mankind.
We're off!
What's happening?
Just as I predicted! Shot into space with the speed of a bullet!
First Men in the Moon. An experience unparalleled on the screen as two worlds meet and clash.
Cover! Help me, cover!
First Men in the Moon. Starring Edward Judd, first human to set foot on a strange new world in space. Martha Hyer, the first woman to experience the indescribable dangers of this other world.
Stay away from there or I'll shoot!
Lionel Jeffries, who discovers an empire beyond imagination. First Men in the Moon.
Hello, welcome to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. Today I'm doing a retro movie review as requested by one of my faithful and loyal viewers, Mr. Paul Gibbons. Thank you, Paul, for suggesting First Men in the Moon. This is a 1964 film. It was actually filmed in 1963. Directed by Nathan Juran, with special effects by the brilliant and legendary Ray Harryhausen. And of course, it's based on the classic science fiction novel from I think it was published in 1901. Pleased to get the chance to have a look at it again. I actually went out of my way to buy the Blu-ray version because it's got some very nice special features on it. And it is such a good film. It's such fun. But it's an interesting, slightly schizophrenic film. The story, for those who don't know, basically is a very fanciful, I think you'd call it science romance, which I think is what they used to call early science fiction until the phrase science fiction is concerned, was created, rather. It's about an eccentric scientist called Cavor, or Dr. Cavor, or Mr. Cavor, or Professor Cavor, who's played in the film by Lionel Jeffries. The other main characters, there's only really three main characters. Edward Judd plays a struggling would-be playwright called Bedford, and his fiancée, Catherine, is played by Martha Hyer. The film actually starts with a contemporary moon landing mission. This film came out 5 years before we actually went to the moon, or the Americans went to the moon. So it predates that by some 5 years, but it tells the story of man's first landing on the moon. When the astronauts get there, they're exploring the moon's surface, and they find an English flag with a message on it, identifying a woman by the name of Catherine. Of course, this causes some excitement back on Earth, and eventually the source of the message is traced to a rather elderly gentleman who's living in a retirement home. It turns out that it's Edward Judd's character in the 1960s, having survived the experience in 1899. He then recounts, via the way of a flashback, the story of how he was actually one of the first men in the moon back in 1899 when he met and teamed up with the eccentric Cavor to travel to the moon by virtue of, well, I can only say something which sounds ridiculous by today's standards. I mean, this film has absolutely no basis in science or scientific reality, which is what makes it fun. Cavor has created a substance called Cavorite, which is basically a coating which counteracts the effect of gravity. So anything that's coated in this or layered in this stuff will effectively shoot into the air. And Cavor has created a space vessel, which is basically a sphere, which is beautiful because the design of it inside, it's all that sort of crushed velvet and ornate sort of Heath Robinson type steampunky levers and dials and buttons and bits of netting for the seats. It's charming in its naivety. And he proposes to travel to the moon in this thing, but just to show that it can be done. Bedford, who's struggling with money, sees the financial potential of this. And by various means, he and Catherine and Caver end up in the capsule, which then explodes up through the roof of the conservatory where Caver has been working on it. And it flies 240,000 miles across space to the moon. It's an interesting film. As I say, it's a slightly odd film. It's great fun. I had a great time watching it, but it's very schizophrenic because the first 40 minutes or so, it is quite slapstick and it's quite comedic, and that's often been put forward as one of the reasons why it wasn't a big hit, because the tone of it is a bit peculiar, because it's knockabout, it's slapstick. Caver is portrayed as this slightly eccentric loony scientist. Bedford, who's played by Edward Judd, has a very nice, light, sort of romantic touch to him. This is interesting because Edward Judd, just a couple of years before, had been in one of my all-time favourite science fiction films, a very bleak, sort of dystopian British film called The Day the Earth Caught Fire, which, if you've never seen it, you really must track it down. It's available on DVD and Blu-ray. So it's in black and white, and it's the story of the temperature on Earth is increasing because of something that's happened to the sun, and it's sort of this disaster movie. It's very bleak, very realistic film. And it's interesting to see Edward Judd in this, because I'm used to seeing him in that film. And in this, he's playing much lighter and clearly having a good time. So anyway, back to the plot. Our heroes eventually find their way on the moon. And it's just the charming naivety of it, which is just makes you smile. You know, they're on this capsule, which is just basically a circular room. I don't know where they go to the toilet. I don't know where they cook their food, but they exist on a diet of kippers. Fortunately, Catherine smuggled some chickens on board, so they've got eggs to eat, which they're all very excited about. But there's no sign of any sleeping quarters. There's no bathrooms. There's no lavatories. I don't want to think about it. But anyway, they land on the moon, and in another quite amusing sequence, Cavor and Bedford are putting on their spacesuits, which are basically diving suits. Diving suits, which incidentally later appeared in Doctor Who serials. Back in 1966, apparently they appeared in the 10th Planet, and in a later Doctor. So it's sort of, I'm fascinated by the history of costumes and props and things. It's all very bizarre. But anyway, they put on these basically simplistic diving costumes, and they're about to go out of the spaceship through the hatch. And suddenly Bedford goes, "Wait! If once we open the hatch, all the air will be sucked out and Catherine will die." And Cable says, "That's okay, she can hide in this storage cupboard." So, it's so funny because it's so outrageous and it's so ludicrous and ridiculous. But you've got to go with the flow because it's such great fun. But then when they get out on the surface, the film actually changes slightly and becomes much more interesting and much more imaginative, because they discover on the moon surface this huge crater with a sort of crystalline sort of covering. They plunge through this thing and they find an underground gallery, an underground chamber, which is full of sentient life. Of course, this was 5 years before we landed on the moon, but I think even at this point, we knew there was no life on the moon. It's a barren rock. But on the moon, according to this film, there are creatures, little mantis-like creatures called selenites, who are all played by children. Really nice, effective sort of costumes with sort of bug eyes and wings. They scuttle around, and there's lots of them. And then there are creatures called, I think there's sort of a working caste. There's loads of them. Then there's other creatures, which are the more intelligent ruling caste. And it's quite well thought out that there's different levels of creatures on this planet. And some of the other creatures are realised by Ray Harryhausen's brilliant stop motion animation. You get this huge caterpillar type thing which moves through the tunnels, which is like a moon cow. And then these other creatures, the Grand Luna, which is the sort of the big head honcho, if you like. And these other creatures, which are done by stop motion, which is always very effective. But what I like about all this stuff is it's played quite straight. And the design of it is beautiful. It really does look like a proper alien civilization. You've got all these rock structures protruding everywhere. You've got these great big vats full of bubbling liquid. And it just does look like an alien society. It's really very imaginative, very colourful and very rich. And it's really exciting. And as I say, the comedy sort of goes pretty much out the window. Cavor becomes a much more serious character. Bedford is the sort of two-fisted hero who's trying to get them back to the ship. They get back to the surface, the capsules disappear because the Salonites have dragged it underground, which is quite convenient. But where the film really sort of works is in its last couple of scenes where Kavor meets up with the Grand Luna, which is this creature behind this big sort of crystal glass thing. And it's quite eerie. And some of the sound effects, again, I recognise the sound effects that appeared in things like The Prisoner and Space 1999 years later, this sort of shrieking, sort of high-pitched sort of sound. But he has this discussion with him, and the Salonite leader, the Grand Luna, wants to know about humanity, wants to know about the humans on the planet Earth, because they've observed the Earth. They don't understand how humanity copes with the heat coming from the sun. And Kavor tries to explain about man, and he explains that there's no one ruler of the planet, but people have over the years tried to take dominion and control the Earth. And the Salonite leader, this Grand Luna, is concerned about that. And this reflects things like The Day the Earth Stood Still, which you may recall I did a retro review some time ago, of other intelligences who are a little bit concerned about man's slightly warlike nature. And he explains about war and how people go to war and they fight. Nobody likes war, but it just happens. And as the Grand Luna says, we're concerned that more men will come from Earth and you'll bring war with you. And that's quite thoughtful. For a film that's been, slightly knockabout, slightly silly, it's suddenly dealing with quite mature issues about the nature of mankind and mankind's sort of warlike tendencies. And I was quite struck by how well that was handled and how well Lionel Jeffries, who'd been this slightly bumbling fool, was taking it quite seriously and delivering this quite impassioned speech to this alien about, give humans a chance. It all ends up with, race to go back to the capsule. Kavor makes a certain decision, and the film then ends coming right up back to the modern day, where Bedford explains how he and Catherine got back to Earth. Nobody believed their story. And then we flash back to the modern moon landing expedition, which discovers the Salonite gallery. But can I spoil a film from 1964? I think I probably can. There's nothing there. It's been abandoned, it's decayed. And Nigel Neal, I'll mention in a moment, who co-wrote the script, he admitted that he stole the idea of the ending of the film from War of the Worlds, and that basically Kavor had a cold when he went to the moon, and that bacteria, which the Salonites and the moon people weren't accustomed to, it had wiped them out, so they became extinct because he'd taken germs to the moon, which is that inverse of War of the Worlds. As I mentioned, it was written by Nigel Neal. This is quite extraordinary, really, because he was one of the great old grandfathers of British science fiction on TV. Of course, he created Quatermass, which had been a phenomenon on BBC for 3 serials in the 1950s. And he went on to do a lot of work. But he took his science fiction quite seriously. I mean, he famously thought Doctor Who was a lot of nonsense and resisted calls for him to work on it. He thought it was trite and twee. He may have a point in some extent. But he was very much a sort of thinking man, science fiction TV writer. So it's quite odd to see him do something quite flippant like this. But I think he was certainly one of those who was quite vocal about the film's weaknesses being the humour, which he felt let the side down a little bit. And I think he's right, because that first 40 minutes or so is flippant, it is throwaway. But when you get to the moon, and ignore all the scientific lunacy of it, the stuff that happens on the moon, and just the whole design of that society is so well realised, even now, 50 years later, pretty much. It still looks really good. And the effects, yes, I always talk about the effects on these retro films, but some of these effects still very good. A lot of these retro films have good effect sequences. They were state of the art at the time. You have to bear that in mind watching them now. But the effects here are still good, and I love Ray Harryhausen's animation. It just makes me feel warm inside because I watched so much of this stuff when I was a kid. So I thoroughly enjoyed this. This was just 95 minutes of just sitting down with a cup of coffee and the cat, just having a good time watching a good old-fashioned, very silly, but also quite thought-provoking British science fiction feature film. Really enjoyed it. First Men in the Moon. It's on DVD and Blu-ray now. Thank you again, Paul Gibbons. Thank you, sir, for suggesting that one as my retro title, because it's one I probably wouldn't have thought of picking up and looking at again, because I'd not seen it for years and just dismissed it, really. But a really good film, and I'm going to give it, I think it's the first half is a bit daft, but the second half is really, really good. So I'm going to give it on that basis a lovely, healthy 7 out of 10. First Men in the Moon. Right, hope you've enjoyed this video. It has gone on a little bit longer than I'd intended. As I've said, I'm going to try to keep my videos to about 10-12 minutes, but this has gone on a little bit longer than that. Apologies. If you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have, there's loads of other retro movie reviews back in the back catalogue in earlier episodes, and plenty more to come. And if you enjoyed this video or any of the content on this channel, then you know what to do. Press that like and subscribe, leave a comment. That would be really nice. Please join in the fun. So that's it from me for now, until I see you next time with some Doctor Who stuff coming up quite soon. There's a review of the next Doctor Who episode. There's a new Doctor Who animation out next week, which I'll be unboxing and reviewing. And lots of other stuff. So stick around, there's stuff going on here. Until next time, you know what they say. You keep taking the stuff.